Go. Cool. So, hello. Welcome everybody to the Crazy Strength Sunday session. We've gone with every other week now. The original reason I set these up was predominantly to help educate the Crazy Strength team when we first started in lockdown, just to keep some kind of social going. And obviously the lockdown side of things seems to be easing now. So I've gone to every other week. They seem to be fairly well received. I'm recording them as well because quite a few of my guys can't make it tonight, but are really keen to listen to the deadlift one. So I'll get it on YouTube with the rest of them. We've had quite a few episodes now. So we've done mobility. We have done squats. We've done a little bit of psychology as well. Next week, we're going to look to do a little bit more psychology on kind of competition preparations and how psychology affects your comp preparation and going through a competition as well. And that'll be that. So for all those that don't know me, my name is Craig Spicer. I've run Crazy Strength now for 5 years. I've worked for the Army as a civilian instructor, and I'm currently head coach of Army weightlifting and Army powerlifting, have been for a number of years now. I work for British Weightlifting delivering courses as well as Eleco as well. That pretty much explains kind of who I am. I used to compete. I still compete, but as a master, so have a little bit of experience competing on all kind of levels as well. So competed nationally as well as internationally for about 4 or 5 years. And as I said, the idea is to develop these so that we can have a 360-degree discussion-based feedback. I know quite a few faces that I can see on here did register prior to the event and put in a few questions and things, so I can steer the discussion around what you're looking to gain from looking at the deadlift through this Zoom discussion. At any point, if you wish to unmute your mic and ask a question or deliver some input, please do. Don't feel shy. I know that Glads is monitoring the chat as well, so anything that goes into the chat, if you don't feel like you're brave enough to unmute your mic and feel like you're butting in, please put it in the chat. Glads will have a little bit of a feel through. He'll find the opportunity to raise that point if he feels it's deemed necessary at that time. Cool, so we are going to cover today deadlifts. So I am going to share my screen and I would like to share, hopefully, this bad boy. Cool. I am hoping that everybody can now see that. If you can't, speak now or forever hold your peace. Perfect. One of the other things I did think to mention was that if you need to go and want to come back or need to go, don't worry about being polite and holding on, just get yourselves away. Any of the future episodes, if you want to jump on, you are more than welcome to jump on. Cool. So Sunday session, 31st of May. I think this is now the 6th or 7th one we've done. So we will look to cover the deadlift. And these are the prior questions we had. I'm just going to change my screen slightly because I find it really weird talking and I can't see anyone's face. Probably the reason why I don't do too much Instagram-y feed stuff. So we're looking at how to work weaknesses off the ground to the shin. Definitely cover that at some point. Creating tension and body positioning. We'll definitely do that to death. Deciding which, I think this is from one of the Paisley boys, looking at which style of deadlift is right for each lifter. We'll cover that to death. If we all have a look at bottom center, I don't think Golden Balls himself is here. That is a direct quote from superstar, current BDFPA world champion for all males. Why is sumo better than conventional? David Watts, 2020. He's probably been saying that since about 2015. I do him a discredit there. And we can look at the assistance work as well. And that's probably going to form more of a discussion based around assistance because it goes back to the whole it depends side of things as well. Cool, so sections we will look to cover tonight. This is one that I kind of chuck in. My mind works in mysterious ways. So there's a couple of bits that I like to bring up that are maybe a little bit reflective and get you thinking in different ways. And I'll bring those up in a second because I will then reiterate those at the end as well as with those questions that have been brought up. So we'll look at what the goal is for the deadlift. We'll look at the options that you have. We'll look at the constants and variables. Those that have been on the squat one already know that I like to teach in an education form so that everybody understands exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. So I found, certainly delivering workshops through the army, the best way to do that was to look at what things within the lift stay as a constant at all times and what things are variable. So what things you can manipulate within the lift to your own advantages. The setup is another interesting one. We'll probably do that to death. That's probably one where we unmute quite a few people and we get quite a big discussion base. Key takeaways, more things that I have probably picked up over the years, things that in the last 3 or 4 days I've kind of, like you do, you're either led at night and something comes into your head, or you're in the shower and it's those sort of times, and I've tried to put down a few of those things that I think, wow, that is a key takeaway for me. That's one of the things I'd like to try and make sure that even if it's not covered in the actual slideshow itself, it's something that we can discuss and take away. And then summary and reflection at the end. We'll look to just have a chat, bring up any answers. If anybody has anything that may well be conjecture towards some of the things that I'll give out, then please, by all means, as long as it's delivered in a polite way, please challenge me, please force me to go away and rethink the way I'm thinking as well. Cool. So I will leave you with, there's 2. So we'll go for the first one. The pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. It's certainly one that has an ethos through Crazy Strength. I try to. That's not me misappropriating the fact that sometimes you do have a bad day and you kind of have pessimistic days where nothing goes right and everything feels heavy. That's okay. But the pessimist generally looks at the difficulty in every opportunity, where an optimist will look for the opportunity. And then that one is a really interesting one. It comes on the back of the 2 that I put up last week, looking at consistency, and we'll kind of reflect on that as we come towards the end. So those that have been on a workshop with me will understand that I try and look at the basics of biomechanics to try and reiterate both good teaching practice, safe teaching practice, and maximum exertion of force. So the whole idea with the deadlift is eliciting as much force as possible into the bar. It is as simple as that. As long as you put maximum force into the bar will move and the maximum amount of weight will move from the floor. It's relatively simple on the face of it. So we look at the basic principles of biomechanics. On one end, we have that prevention of injury. And on the other hand, you have maximizing performance. And at some point, every single one of us is on that scale to some point. Now, depending on where you are in a training cycle, depending on what level you're at, will depend upon where within that cycle you are going to be looking. Even elites will probably look at a bit of injury prevention stuff when they've just come off the back of a competition and they're kind of deloaded and they're going back into a competition cycle. They're going to look at prevention of injury, because even if you're competing at elite level, when you maximize your performance, there are going to be some risks. And the biggest example I gave during the squat one was looking at a baseball pitcher contorting themselves into such positions that improve performance, but will leave them with elbow injuries for the rest of their lives. And that's the sacrifice they make. They understand those basic principles. They accept that if they are maximizing that performance, their prevention of injury is almost, I don't want to say it's being ignored, but it's certainly going to be kind of put on the back burner, because performance is the biggest thing. So what are your options? Lucas, I promise you would be on there. One of our up-and-coming lifters who has done a lot of work. If anybody saw the Crazy Strength Instagram today, you'll have seen the awesome progress that Lucas has made. Technically, he's made a lot of progress, though has a lot of new progress coming. Interestingly, Lucas is either a 75 or an 82.5 lifter. I would surmise that going forward, he's probably going to end up being an 83 lifter, probably lifts around 78, 79 currently. But you can see there with conventional, we look at it typically suiting a taller and longer lifters. It's predominantly hamstring dominant and it's hip hinge pattern driven. We look at the other main option. So you have sumo. Yeah, Golden Balls has made it on there as probably my most efficient sumo deadlifter. Not necessarily the best technically, because of his start position and where his shoulders are. I hope he watches this now, because he's going to be cursing me. But it does enable me to stick a rocket up his bum. It typically suits a smaller, more compact lifter, is typicep dominant, and is predominantly notice I've put predominantly squat pattern rather than hip hinge. There is always going to be an element of hip hinge because of it being anteriorly loaded, the same as you would do for a conventional lift. Notice I've also put hybrid within there as well. So hybrid for me is what you would refer to as either hybrid or squat stance. It's normally a stance where you start with your normal squat stance, take your feet a couple of inches out either side. Toes are almost pointing forwards, but your hands are inside rather than outside in the conventional lift. There's a couple of really good operators within the IPF that are using that style of lift at the moment. Eddie Cohen is probably the biggest one that has kind of put that sort of lift out there because it matches biomechanics quite nicely. Now, whilst I suggest that conventional typically suits taller and longer lifters, and sumo typically suits smaller and more compact lifters, that doesn't mean to necessarily say that your limbs and lever lengths and anthropometrics will have that as your ideal position or ideal ability to emit force through the bar. It also doesn't mean that that's the one that rocks your world. I have plenty of lifters that either A, suit both, or B, hate sumo lifting, normally because it's come off the back of people saying sumo is cheating. It's within the rules, so it kind of is and it isn't. And there's a reason why people say it's a cheating deadlift, and we can come to that as we go through. But you'll find, and I know there was a research paper that I think was kind of mid-90s, I think it was 95, 96, which looked at lifters within the IPF on the international stage, and it looked at a higher percentage, I want to say 70% plus of 90 kilos lifters and below were utilizing sumo as their ideal go-to deadlift. And it completely switched as soon as you went over kind of 90 kilos, so that 70% of those that were 90 kilos plus were prioritizing conventional, which suggests that the taller and longer you get, the more you are suited to either one of those lifts. As I said, making it rock your world and whatever makes you tick is probably the one you should be training. So we'll start with the constants within a deadlift. I'm going to try and whiz through these because these are things that most people that are probably on here and most people that are going to watch this afterwards, it's going to be things that aren't really new to you. So bar path, the bar moves straight up and straight down. We've all seen those lifters that have their knees too far forward in the lift and the bar goes out in front, which will change the bar path. Anytime that bar path goes from that plumb line straight up and straight down, then you will be leaking power. So we look back at the original goal, we're looking to elicit as much force or as much power into that bar to move that bar as possible. If that bar moves anywhere other than straight up and straight down, you are utilizing force to A, push it away from you or towards you, which is highly unusual, but it's normally away from you. You're also having to utilize effort then to bring that bar back in and control that bar. So all of that effort in that 3 seconds that you're going to be making that lift, because if it's longer than 3 seconds, you're probably not going to make that lift. I've seen them, but they're very rare. So we then look down to the knees tracking the toes. So throughout the movement, the knees should track the toes and be stable without lateral movement. So we shouldn't see the knees dropping in a knee valgus like we do a squat. We shouldn't need them tracking out. It's highly unusual in that sort of load as well. Obviously, it's normally a kind of lateral glute or quadricep weakness that tends to allow them to then drop in, or a tight groin. Good. So we're going to flick flat to a variable. So this is where it starts to get a little bit interesting. So foot position is probably one of the biggest variables that I would suggest can be manipulated to your advantage. So we look back to that biomechanical slide and we can take that into account now, where we either try and prevent injury or we try to maximize that performance. Now, there are a couple of things, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but there are a couple of things that I would suggest for eliciting maximal force through the floor which need to be a constant. But here we can change those, and we're changing those. So conventional, ideally your foot position is directly underneath the hips. A lot of people would look to have them directly underneath the shoulders. We want to try and look at pillars of power. So we want to make sure that your femur are directly underneath your hip girdle, and that force is being pushed straight through the floor, through that heel, not necessarily through the heel, but about a third in front of the heel. Obviously we are laterally, anteriorly loaded, so it's going to have to be biased slightly within the feet. So we're not going to be directly across the middle of the foot like we are a squat for a conventional deadlift. It's going to be slightly biased to the heels to stop that anterior tilt. For sumo and hybrid or squat stance, ideally directly underneath the knee, so that the shin ideally is vertical, which is one of the next constants we have. So to optimize and reduce that range of movement, so if we're able to elicit a high amount of force, but through a shorter range of movement, you may lift more weight. So we see a lot, and it's much more common in sumo, where you get the cheaters version of sumo, as I will allow it to be called, and you take your feet almost out as far as you can, you open your hips up as much as you can, and you look to execute the lift as you would do. So the issue with this is that not only do you open up issues for dropping weights on your toes, which is a little crazy, you're no longer pushing the force directly through a vertical shin, and the amount of pressure and balance that you need to go through the hips, depending on the force you're trying to generate as you're trying to move it. You're then looking at maximizing that performance, looking to cheat your way into the lift a little bit more than you are looking at injury prevention. So for me, and we'll go into that constant there, your optimal position in a shin position is vertical. It is your maximal position to elicit force. Now, is that possible for everybody? No, it's not. Are we as coaches able to manipulate that position centimeter by centimeter? I know Susie and I have done a lot of that with squat and with deadlift over the last kind of 6 to 9 months. And there are some changes where we've tinkered something out, we've moved it back in. There's no, unless you've got all the Gucci gear, there's no perfect science to it. It's the same as your weightlifting eye, being able to see how the angles meet and how the angles don't meet. So we look at that shin position should ideally be vertical for longevity within the sport of maximizing that the long-term output. The issue that we have is not everybody is looking for longevity within the sport. A lot of people will get into these barbell sports, certainly weightlifting and powerlifting, and it comes off the back of things like CrossFit, where people do make very quick gains very quickly. A lot of bang for your buck kind of sports with the CrossFit side of things. And unfortunately, that sort of progress, I mean, you get the first 6 to 8 weeks, which is predominantly neural. So your body gets much better at asking the muscles to contract from brain through myelin sheath to muscle. It contracts much better. So your first 6 to 8 weeks are not necessarily actual bona fide muscular gains. There'll be a little of hypertrophy, but a lot of that will be neural within that first 6 to 8 weeks, which is what we refer to as newbie gains. And then you'll start to accumulate that resistance as you go through basic bog standard linear programming, which we can come through to towards the end. So whilst you will gain a lot and I did it, I made this mistake. I moved my feet out really early when I moved to sumo. I jumped from 162.5 to 175 really quickly within about 6 to 7 weeks. And this is after probably 2 years of actually training as a power lifter. But I started to pick up niggles and things like that. So, you know, I've made these mistakes as well. So I can see firsthand how you, as an athlete, you will look to try and make that. But obviously as a coach, that's where I will, you know, look to come in and try and encourage other coaches to go, right, you can do that. That's great. But if you want to be maximal long-term and compete on the big stage, you need to think about eliciting force in the safest way. Hand position, there is no other way to put it. It has to be directly underneath your shoulders, no matter what the lift is. Interestingly, if you have your feet shoulder width apart in a conventional lift, you cannot have your hands directly underneath your shoulders. So your hands will be directly next to your legs, and your scapular may find it slightly hard to stay in a nice neutral position as well. Shin position we've already covered, so I shall swiftly move on to that bad boy. Cool, so grip. Anyone that's been on one of these, and I am more than happy for anybody to start jumping in and questioning on that sort of stuff. So it's a personal choice. As long as, for me, this is one of the things I cover in any of the workshops. I try and give the information as to why you would choose each of these grips. It probably sounds as though I'm probably going to start steering you towards hook grip. because I probably am. But a closed pronated double hand over grip is great, but you have the rotation of the bar and the rotation potentially of the, depending on how efficient you are as a lifter. The bar is going to start to rotate at some point. Any rotation or torque through that is going to put stress on your grip. So it's not going to be maximal. You're not going to lift as much as you can. You have your alternator grip, one hand forward, one hand underneath. It's a very strong grip. It works really well. It stops that bar from rotating. The issue that I have and had with it are that it doesn't necessarily put the shoulder girdle into a healthy, natural position if you're not aware of what that healthy, natural position is. So we have one internally rotated shoulder and one externally rotated shoulder. One of them or both of them will then tend to be drawn forwards into a pec dominant position if you are benching a lot as well and not looking after your back. So for me, hook grip is my preferred lift. Do I force it upon lifters? Absolutely not. Do I make it a suggestion? Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the big things we don't want is tension within the arms. I'm sure everybody's seen the videos online where you've got a predominantly in conventional lifts, because it is such a longer lift compared to a sumo. Most will get to the knee, they'll start to stick point just below the knee, and the body will automatically go, I'm really struggling here. I need to take the shortest route. I need a shortcut. I need to cheat. And the first thing your body will try and do is shorten that lever length, so it will bend at the elbow if there is tension there, because the tension means that it wants to work. The brain is wanting it to work. And we see lots of videos where long head of bicep just ping straight up into the up underneath the shoulder. I've seen it firsthand. I watched a good friend of mine do this. It's not nice. 9 times out of 10, when you've got adrenaline going, you have no idea it happens until you've finished. Will it be a career stopper? No. Will it limit your maximal potential? Yes, and it will probably restrict your ability to maintain that position from there as well. So for me, hook grip is probably the better alternative. If you're squeezing the living daylights at your thumbs, yes, it hurts your thumbs. 100% get that. I think my best deadlift with hook grip was a 192.5 at 56 kilo. And that was hook grip. And I had no idea I was using hook grip until I finished the lift, because my thumbs started hurting afterwards. When you're 1 rep maxing, you will not be thinking about your thumbs. In training, it can prove to be hard work. So I know one of the questions that came out, how to train your grip and when to use straps. Using straps actually didn't come out as a question. It's a question that I kind of added on to how to train your grip. So they kind of both go hand in hand. I'm gonna give it the layman answer. I try and keep it fairly simple to start with before explaining what I mean. If you struggle with grip, use your grip until you can no longer use your grip, then strap. If you don't struggle with your grip and it's maximal strength that you struggle with through those ranges of movement, then use straps, especially for reps. But know that at some point you are going to have to use it as well. I've had too many lifters that come to me dependent upon straps. I use straps, especially for the weightlifting side of things, but I only use straps when I need to use it, and I've never had an issue with grip. I've never, touch wood, failed a lift because of grip, because I train appropriately for it. So training grip, there's lots of different ways you can do it. You can create a single bar, or you can put a chain on a bar and run a weight over the top, and you can roll it down and then roll it back up. Works really nicely. There's quite a few of those that come down there. One of the best ones I like for grip are jumping up and hanging on the bar. Yeah, no, that's it. Just hang on the bar. Hang on the bar as long as you can. If you want to stay on that bar as long as you can, your grip will improve. Either that or just picking up odd objects. I was in the garden yesterday picking up some odd bags. My forearms and my hands are sore because I was picking up objects I wasn't used to. So there's lots of different ways to train your grip. If just deadlifting or just doing pull movements, using dumbbells, if you don't already use dumbbells, is another good way, because it's working on moving that grip through space and time. If your grip's bad, don't rely on straps to improve your deadlift, because if you're going to look to compete at some point, you are going to have to deadlift without straps, and that will be the defining factor. Right, I think I've whinged enough. Hip position. This is one where I might have done a couple of doodles within paint. I should probably have actually said that my child has drawn them in paint, because I'm not very good at drawing at the best of times. But it's one of the ones where hip position depends. I'm sure it's not news to any of you that as the bar leaves the floor with a deadlift, your hips and shoulders must move together. If your hips move before your shoulders, you are not only changing the angle you are trying to elicit force at, you are also losing tension from a position that you wanted to not lose tension from, but you've also lost force and power is being leaked left, right, and Chelsea. So if your hips and shoulders don't work together in a deadlift, the same as you would do moving a clean or a snatch off the floor, you are not helping yourself elicit maximal force through the floor. So the simple answer is they need to be between your hips and your shoulders. The balance of where that optimal position is it depends. And I am going to stop sharing that for a second. Hello, good people. And I am going to try and share. Yes. Glads, just give me a thumbs up that you can see my awesome drawings. Good. So I've even labeled them in my childish abilities. Glads, can you see my cursor? Perfect. So we can see here, so A, B, and C are all conventional lifts. D and E are sumo lifts. It was easier for me to do the conventional lifts from a side-on view and then look at the sumo from a front-on view, but we can discuss kind of both ways. So everybody's seen that lift in A. It is the normal guy that is looking to try and squat their deadlift. It's quite common in new lifters. It normally comes off the back of people that have seen strongmen lifters. Strongmen lifters generally, and I'll use Eddie Hall as an example, although Thor is similar, but his anthropometrics are a little bit different to Eddie Hall's. Eddie is a little bit more stocky and probably a little bit more built for his size. So because Eddie Hall set up at the bottom with a wide, big squat stance, rolled the bar away, rolled the bar back in, and then started his lift, everybody decided that they were going to do it that way because that's how the strongest guy in the world does. What they don't realize is there's a reason why Eddie Hall does that. It's because if he starts in a hip hinge, he cannot elicit the force that he needs to, or force that he requires to be able to generate the force to lift that 500 kilos off the floor. It's also because if Eddie Hall sets up like a normal human being, there is so much in and around his shoulder girdle and chest that if he goes down to pick it up and set up like we would not us mere mortals do, he'd probably stop breathing after about 4 to 6 seconds because it's pressing against his windpipe. So he has no choice but to set up in that way. However, for us normal mere mortals, if we look to use that, we have this angle here, which is over, what did we say it was? 90, 180, 270. It's probably 290 degrees. So we're having to elicit enough force to overcome 270 degrees to move that bar off the floor. We know that within a hip hinge position, your hamstrings eccentrically loaded and your quadriceps concentric loaded will generate much more force than just your quadriceps working concentrically. So at the moment, you're only going to have your quadriceps shortening. You're going to struggle to even switch your hamstrings on at position A. So 9 times out of 10, unless you're Eddie Hall, you will see those hips move until you get to at least position C. And that's only if you are able to regain the strength of your hamstrings or the eccentric and concentric loading of those hamstrings. They'll probably then get to point B. They'll have lost everything. And they'll probably start looking like a dog having a poo because I couldn't figure out how to draw a wobbly line on B. But you'll start to see thoracic spine is gone, lumbar spine is gone, and all the bracing has been lost. So it leads us on nicely to point B, someone who sets themselves up as if they are an ironing board. So they've heard you need to hip hinge your deadlift. They have hamstrings that are rock solid, like pieces of iron, and they good morning their deadlift, which to an extent is okay. so long as everything is technically okay. Your lumbar spine is still there. You have a small curve in that lumbar spine. Everything is tight. You are braced into your belt, and your thoracic spine is nice and straight as well. You are, to an extent, at maximal lifts. By maximal lifts, it's going to have to be over 3 times your body weight. Otherwise, there's no reason why you are jeopardizing your thoracic spine. There's no reason why you can't have a curve in your thoracic spine in a conventional deadlift. However, that curve in your thoracic spine must be the same when you finish as it is when you started. If there is movement through the spine whilst you are moving a weight with force, then it is going to go through the tendons and the connective tissue throughout the spine, and is going to put them at risk. You're going to be putting pressure on each of those vertebrae, and you are at risk of injury. So we go back to that risk of injury, maximizing that performance. You will also find there are ratios of maximal exertion for loading the hamstring eccentrically and your quadriceps concentrically. I've not looked at the data for quite some time. I vaguely remember that for your 100% of your maximum concentric quadricep force, I think it's somewhere around 60% eccentric force generated through your hamstrings to be a relatively even load. I will happily stand corrected on that, and it's probably something I should go away and have a look at. But you'll find that there needs to be that balance between that force, and if there isn't that balance between those forces between the antagonistic pairs of your quadriceps and hamstrings, then that bum is going to move. So for those that have asked the question, where should my hips start and how do I stop them from moving? You need to get them to a position where they don't move when you start in the deadlift. If that's not an optimal force and you can't keep that back position, it is either because A, your quadriceps or your concentric quadriceps, so you're shortening, your eccentric, so you're shortening under load of the hamstrings, isn't even, and or you cannot keep your spine as neutral as possible. Your thoracic and lumbar spine are at risk of popping. So that brings us on to C. Now, C is probably a little bit low, actually, for an optimal position for most. It probably should be up a tiny bit, but it gives you a good representation of what I would see as an almost go-to hip hinge position. It's probably something in between C and B. I'll put that on record because C is probably still too much of a squat. But you can see that here in B, we have much less angle to overcome, but we're not generating force from those legs as much as we were here. You're not eliciting force from here, but from this position, we can elicit force from both of those if the bum was probably here, and we're able to maintain that neutral spine. So we can elicit maximal force from the glutes stabilizing, both at the knees. We can elicit maximal force eccentrically in the hamstrings, concentrically through the quads, and then as we get past the knee, we then have that concentric force coming through with the hamstrings and the glutes, which finishes the lift. We'll go through that as we go. Now, D is what we kind of discussed with your cheating sumo. E is probably more towards your standard squat stance sumo. So something in between is what a lot of my lifters use. Dave is probably the purest example, only because he has done it for so long that you can see where the progress has come. Whereas if he had gone to D, you're probably, and he'll bang on about his knees as much as anyone, but his risk of injury is more down to the repetitiveness of the sport and the loads that he puts through the knees. Clearly, the boy has deadlifted 4 times body weight, and that is only going to get heavier because he has done a 270 now. So I'm anticipating that going up a little bit as well. But you need to find that balance again. And this is probably one for the Paisley boys. The answer to your questions on which one is right for my lifter, it depends. You need to manipulate them into those positions to figure out what is maximal in those forces. Make sure that those hips are somewhere between the knees and the shoulders. They're not rocket science. I'm not saying anything that you guys don't already know. And it's trying to work out, and this is the hardest part from a coaching perspective, is that the right position that the hips need to be in? Or do they have weak quads? Do they have weak hamstrings? Is their core weak? Are they flexing the position? Is it just proprioceptive? Are they not able to feel what it is like to brace properly and go into those good positions? Cool. Let's move on from that one because I can't stomach looking at those anymore. So,
Craig, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, mate.
Just so, obviously, my background is definitely not powerlifting. So, from a powerlifting standpoint, if somebody was to come in new into the sport, and I'm fully aware you would look at anthropometrics, their biomechanics, their training age, their experience, etc. What's the sort of go-to technique that you would use for the deadlift?
I would almost certainly get everyone conventionally deadlifting to start with. And 9 times out of 10, everyone's already conventionally deadlifted, just probably not done it very well. Do you know what I mean?
Sort of where your standpoint was from a powerlifting coach's perspective, because obviously weightlifting and functional modalities of training, that's a lot different. But it's interesting to know that you would do that. Yeah,
I think for weightlifting, it's an easier decision because. And you'll know,
it's sport specific, exactly.
Looking at the key positions that British weightlifting have put out in their technical model, which is very good actually. We know that we need to get and hit those positions, which is the same but different. There's more options. There's lots more kind of. A lot of people kind of negate the technical aspect of powerlifting, but as you already know, it's probably the side that makes me tick. But 9 times out of 10, and you've probably had people come to you going, oh yeah, I want to be a powerlifter, I want to do this. And then 6 months after doing some deadlifts and some squats and some benching, they kind of go, this is quite boring. I don't really want to do this. And that's the point you go, this sport isn't for you.
Exactly.
And that's the point at which you go, no, it's good. Because that's the point you go, well, you're quite stocky, you're quite small, and your conventional deadlift is good. Let's have a play with sumo or squat stance, and you'll get there's no wrong answer, because if anyone, we found this with Sean Smithson as well. We trained Sean, who should be a sumo deadlifter. His anthropometrics suggest he is, but the same as Gary Allen that was on here as well. They both, at the time, really loved lifting with a conventional deadlift. And if that's what makes them tick, that's what they love. The good thing.
Sport specific, obviously, for me personally, from strength and conditioning perspective, a sumo deadlift wouldn't be a regular protocol that's used.
It's not functional.
It's not in any way, because it can be utilized in some aspects. But
it works really well, sumo, for lockout in a conventional lift.
There are some benefits to it. So it's just sort of your novice standpoint, because obviously I do have the occasional goal of an athlete is to increase their lifts, but for me, if I've obviously anthropometrics regardless, or biomechanics, it would 9 times out of 10 be conventional based. So
it's an interesting one, that, because obviously yours are predominantly strength and conditioning goals rather than strict powerlifting goals. So
and it's only, some of them come with a real strange outlook on their low hanging fruit. So if you remember, those of you people that are around and we spoke about goals, etc., some of them come with an outlook of, that they're performance related. So if it's not track and field, if it's not rugby performance, if it's not football, biathletes, lots of different athletes that I work with, some of them come with things like, I'd really, really like to achieve a 200 kilo deadlift or a double bodyweight deadlift. And I'm like, well, that's a goal that is pertinent, but we need to make sure they're aligned to your sport first before we start tackling. So no, that's why it's interesting from a somebody who's a complete novice to powerlifting. If somebody was to come into the sport, conventional would be your optimal one to go to start with.
Yeah, I mean, like if the goal, it's an easy win for you, because if a small female triathlete under 50 kilos went, I want a double bodyweight deadlift, stick him in a sumo position, take the legs out nice and wide, keep the knees out, double bodyweight deadlift, off you go. But actually,
and it's the small wins in their mind that keep them adhering to the program. So I get it completely.
Maximising performance, and whether that's going to then transition to their sport, that's a really hard one for an S&C coach. Again, it depends. If you want that quick win and they're at a real low point in their training, and then maybe there's no wrong answer, I guess, there, so long as everything's safe.
I'm just very interested in.
Yeah, no, I like that.
I think you're tippling me over to powerlifting a little bit here, mate. I might have
Oh, cool.
might have to come in and have a try.
Oh, mate, we'll do that. If we do a weightlifting session, we can always. And whenever I've had someone that's never really tried sumo, I'm known as a sumo coach, a squat coach and a deadlift coach predominantly, but I'm known for technical work on sumo. So we can always do that after a powerlifting day, a weightlifting day. I get muddled up.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's a really interesting one. When and how to create and brace tension. And this is, again, it's athlete dependent. I know so many athletes, and Gary Allen's one that actually I've bullied him for about 9 months now and gone, you are most definitely a sumo deadlifter. Yeah, you're okay as a conventional deadlift. And actually we had that chat before Christmas last year and went, that's fine. You don't enjoy sumo. You really enjoy conventional. Interestingly, the issue he had off the floor was positioning for sumo because his mobility wasn't as good as it could be to get into those good positions. And the one thing I told him that he needed to work on to actually get better at his conventional was his positioning off the floor because he couldn't hold the good positions. He worked on that during the start of lockdown, decided to then try just have a little play with the sumo deadlift, and wow, it looked like a completely different lift compared to 3 months ago. However, what Gary was doing is stereotypically what you'd see from your average powerlifter who would go in the gym, get all tense and maximally aroused and bang their chest and run up to the bar, get all really tense at the top and then go down and get really tense. And there's loads of tension, but they're not actually using the tension for what the goal is. They're just tense. They're just they're just rock solid, and which is something you want to be, but in the right positions. So for me, I mean, I prefer people setting up in the bottom because it means they can get into the ideal position to then set this up. So, and we'll kind of talk about that as you go through. But for some people, it works setting themselves up, so the feet at the top, get the feet sorted, get the knees in the right position, get into position, and then go. Or you can set it all up, get all the positioning, tighten up, and go. It's a trial and error type thing. It's probably one actually that is probably better to do with coach there if you have an experienced coach. Breathing, how much and how. So we look at something called the Valsalva Maneuver. We're looking to, obviously we have the rib cage, which allows us to be able to breathe into that rib cage, squeeze your upper back, so your lats, and squeeze in that shoulder girdle together to keep that thoracic spine nice and tight and keep it fairly neutral, which most people kind of, if you take a hold of something in front of you and externally rotate at both arms and squeeze your shoulder blades back and down, almost like you've got a pencil under your armpit, that's kind of your ideal. So you want to squeeze that pencil underneath the armpit and make sure you don't let it go, but your hands need to be nice and relaxed. There's your upper body or your upper back tension. You've got no bone other than your spine in and around your lower half of your core. So you need to be able to use your belt to be able to do that. So again, we see your kind of stereotypical powerlifter will go into the gym and take a massive breath, and we'll see, Lucas, I'm going to give you a negative as well. And I think you changed it on your squats you did for me this week. But it's very common to see them take a really big breath and that bar jumps up 2 or 3 inches and it's now not in a stable position or it's moved. I'm very anal on keeping everything the same and consistent every time. So what we really want to do is we want to take a big breath, probably about 80%, nothing drastic. So not so that you've got too much tension that you can no longer think about anything other than the fact you've got a massive breath. You want half of that breath to be in your abdominals, half of that breath to be in your chest. And you want to be squeezing those abdominals and pushing the abdominals against the belt as if someone is going to come up to you and punch you in the stomach. If you've got that balance really well, you should stay rigid without being too rigid. If you can't keep your neutral spine, it's either that you cannot handle the load and you're risking injury and you're not ready for it yet, or you haven't taken a big enough breath and you're not sure, or you don't know how to do it. There's plenty of coaches in and around on here. I know there's a good few coaches within here as well. So if you want to touch base and want to, even if it's over Zoom, I know most of us have those access to that sort of stuff. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of breathing, how much. So it's not too much, but you need to breathe enough. And you need to do it just before you make the lift Have a pause to check your technique and then go. Don't take the breath at the top, then set up, and then realize that you're about to pass out because you've starved your brain of oxygen for 7 to 10 seconds. Neutral spine. We've kind of already covered this as we go through, thankfully, but it's something I want to make sure we cover. Neutral spine is something within the strength and conditioning world we tend to teach as a natural, normal, healthy position for the spine to be in. You can have some T-spine flexion within a deadlift, so long as that spine does not flex throughout the movement. Once the bar leaves the floor, that spine needs to stay in that position. Even if it has gone into an unhealthy position, if your lumbar spine is flexed, if it flexes more with 200 kilos going through it, your risk of those vertebrae popping things out is so high, it's unbelievable. And you do one of them, you are never deadlifting like that ever again. So longevity in the sport, I cannot push anymore. Equipment's an interesting one. Footwear, belts, and their use. So footwear should be fairly simple. I have seen randomly a couple of people tip up in Olympic lifting shoes to a powerlifting meet. I'm not really sure why. Possibly because they're an Olympic lifter and they've always done their snatch or clean deadlifts with shoes, and it's comfortable for them. It's anthropometrically submaximal. You need to be as grounded to the floor as possible. Either Converse or fighting boots are kind of the two kind of go-tos for me. I think I lent my, I had some Adidas Havocs, which went to every single Worlds with me. I think Tilly currently has them and has stolen them forever now. But she is getting good use out of them. And yes, she has deadlifted more than me now. So breaking up the lift. So they are the four kind of transitions that I know Elico have looked to kind of use in delivering the powerlifting side of things. They're the suggestions I've made for the course that we are currently writing. And they are fairly similar to the weightlifting side of things, but I think it's good to have that common knowledge or the common language that we have. So that first pull is fairly simple. It is to just below the knee. The transition is going from below the knee to just above the knee. Your second pull is where your body comes through or where your hips come through. Then your lockout is nice and tall. We'll maybe go through each of those as we go. So we know that in the first pull, hips and shoulders must move together. Your shins ideally are vertical or as vertical as your anthropometrics will allow you to be. And they will literally, your hips and shoulders stay working together all the way to just below the knee. The transition's fairly simple. The transition is where your hamstrings and quads will start swapping over on which is working more. And the hamstrings will need to be working concentrically rather than keeping that balance of eccentric and concentric force. So what you need to really work hard. We see a lot of people shaking like a shitting dog, certainly in conventional and in the heavier sumos. That's just where the neural system is overloaded and struggles to cope with that overload. So it's a surprise when it first happens, but people do get used to it. Your body, every time you 1 rep max, your neural system has to cope with a force it's never been used to emitting and cope with before. And that's where your discipline side comes into it. That stays exactly the same, ideally, as you go over the knee. What we don't want to do is bring that bar towards us because we're taking the bar off of that plumb line. What we now need to do is make sure that those shoulders stay over the bar. So depending on your lever lengths, your shoulder will be just in front of the bar with your scapula over, or your shoulders will be directly over the bar. Those that are longer might be just in front of that bar. Those that are smaller, you will be just shoulders directly over that bar. If we're behind the bar, there's no way that bar can go in a plumb line. And obviously there's some compensation for how far your hips are as the fulcrum from where the bar is related, depending upon whether it's a nice tight conventional or your feet are nice and wide, getting a bit closer to the bar with those hips. So that transition takes the bar over the knee. So from the knee, ideally, we want to keep those shoulders over that bar as long as we can. And only as the hips come towards the bar, the hamstrings contract concentrically, hips come towards the bar as the shoulders come up and back, rather than the hips coming to the bar and your shoulders coming back too early, which means that we see that strongman hitch, which in powerlifting is a no lift. So one really good cue, I know Lucas is lifting, so I'll subconsciously drop that in there for Lucas. Stay over that bar a little bit longer until that bar is just above the knee, and then keep that back nice and tight and get those hips and shoulders through. Really try and, I mean, it's a corny kind of cue, but hump the bar, get those hips towards the bar, really squeeze that upper back, which takes the bar through the second ball into the lockout. I know Meg is on there listening, and I did actually message last night. I know she was interested in listening to this one, and soft knees in the lockout is one of them. It's very common in a new lifter not to know what it feels to be kind of locked out. The wording in the rule book is to stand erect, which everybody giggles at. Why is no one giggling? Erect. Yeah, there we go, lads. Good lad. So you need to be stood up. The reason why we need to have the legs locked out is to show control, and that everything is under control and you're in control of that bar. If the knees are not locked out and they are slightly soft, the official that's in front of you or the two to the sides don't understand whether you are in control of that or not. So even if you're not fully locked out, you need to look like you're fully locked out. So stand up nice and tall, squeeze those shoulder blades, stand as tall as you can. It's very common if you are a beginner and have not yet felt what it feels like to lock out a weight that is relatively heavy, or the weight has got into your head before you've even kind of lifted the weight, or you haven't got the musculature in and around the knees yet to either feel what it is to lock out, be able to lock out, or have the contractual mass around your knee to look like you're locked out. And it is as simple as that. If an official can see that your muscles are working and are still, it looks locked out. So that will come. Don't worry about that. And that's one thing who has made a lot of progress on the subscription program actually, and has a lot of potential too. Whether we go sumo or not is another thing, but we'll come to that. And yeah, there we go. That's my kind of. I'm same as most barbell athletes. I am quite obsessive. My OCDs overtake a lot of things. So that is my natural kind of go-to. When you brace, whether it's at the top or at the bottom, is whether you either sort where your feet go, work out where your knees are. If you're bracing from the top, you brace, then you work out where your hips need to be, check your neutral spine, make sure the shoulder's in the right position, get your grip, pull into that bar, and then execute the lift. And it should just be a pushing away. I know it's a note that I've got. One interesting way to reflect on a deadlift is that it's not a pull movement, it's a push movement. And if you cut yourself off at your waist, everything that is below that waist is generating force, is eliciting force into the floor. You are pushing the world away. Everything above the hips is stabilizing. That's it. None of your upper body should be generating force. It is there just to maintain your position and make sure the bar stays where it is. Everything below the waist is eliciting force. So if you have any shortening of any joint angles above the waist, you're wasting your time. You are not using the biggest muscles you can do. Perfect. So I think this was one that I know Susie put up. So, and if I don't cover this in enough detail, what I won't go into is kind of programming, because we could be here all day, but I will talk about some of the specific barbell stuff that we use or that I like to use and are easy to use from a programming perspective. And we'll look at maybe some more of the non-specific stuff. For the non-specific stuff, it's probably easiest in a second that if people go, I've got this issue, what do I need to do? What can I do? And all that sort of stuff. If there's a deathly silence, I will just move on and no one gets help. So the barbell specific stuff, it doesn't have to be complicated. I see so many coaches, certainly through Instagram, that are creating these crazy ass exercises to make everything really cool and really niche. And I've done this a few times now. For the first couple of years, you're probably going to be doing some form of linear programming that is going to be manipulating the fitness variables. So you're looking at intensity, volume, frequency, and everything else in between. So that might be the reps, the sets, the recovery, how often you lift throughout the week or throughout the days. You might lift twice a day, all of that jazz. All of that is fairly Billy basics. And for example, if you don't have enough musculature to maintain your position, I'm going to give you 5 sets of 10 on a deadlift at 60%. Because guess what? it's going to elicit a lot of growth, and it's going to elicit a lot of muscular structure. Even some of the guys that I've got, and I think Glad's is one of them, Glad's has been 18 months, nearly 2 years, and has had a lot of barbell training in his background as well. He is, I mean, some of the exercises are getting a bit more specific towards the powerlifting stuff with Andersons and things like that. But we are going through a good amount of volume in those lifts. And guess what? He's doing some bodybuilding training as well, because if you don't have contractual mass, yeah, he's smiling as well. If you don't have that contractual mass in around those areas, guess what? If it's not going to help with, or if it's not going to restrict your movement of getting in that ideal position, then you're going to need that mass to take through. So quad squad, I love it. So we look at, certainly specific to the deadlift, you then have things like deficits, tempos, rack pulls, and pause variants. So deficits will help if you struggle off the floor and struggle to break parallel, sorry, it's getting late now. If you struggle off the floor, struggle to break the floor, either in conventional or in sumo, it's much more common in sumo that you will struggle off the floor. You will probably use deficits. The one thing you've got to be careful of in deficits is that the more the deficit, the more it changes the lift. So it depends on how much you want to change the lift, how much you want to elicit a change in stimulus for the musculature that you want to elicit that change for, to make it specific to what you're trying to do. So for example, my kind of go-to is for a conventional, where we can keep that position fairly well. If they're a really long lifter, 2 to 3 inches, if they're a small lifter, like myself, you could go as far as maybe 4 inches before it really starts to deteriorate the actual technical aspect of the lift, and still have carryover to it. And you can do everything as long as it's safe. You can hit doubles, you can do everything. You can go all the way up to 8s and 10s and 12s. I don't recommend it. You get some really unhappy athletes. Tempo is a really nice one, and it's used quite a lot within the bodybuilding world. If you increase the amount of tempo or the elicited time under tension, you will increase the amount of force that the actual muscular structure is having to cope with. It will overload the central nervous system in thinking it needs to generate more muscular tissue in that area. And it's a really good area or a really good way of stimulating growth in a weak area and finding out where those weak areas are. So for example, I might give someone a tempo of in a back squat. Let's stick to deadlifts. So generally an eccentric stimulus will provide more muscular bang for your buck than a concentric. If anybody wants me to explain the science behind that, I can, but we'll do it at the end. Just remember that one and I'll come back to it. But you might, for example, have a nice controlled concentric phase, 3 seconds, a nice controlled lockout for someone like me who struggles with a lockout, but maybe doesn't feel where the lockout is. Have a 2-second pause at the top, and then you might have an 8-second eccentric load, which means you've really got to focus on keeping those arms long. You're probably going to use straps for these because it is going to overload that grip, and we don't necessarily need to work the grip. If you're doing 5 reps of 8-second eccentrics, you're holding on that bar for a long time. So that's one exception where you might use straps. And I would advise using straps so you can really focus on that eccentric load. And it's putting a lot of tension through that position. It also means that if someone's really struggling in that top section or that bottom section, you're going to see the bar really speed up. If they're really good from the floor, it'll be nice and controlled when you get back towards the floor. If they're really bad at the top, it's probably not going to be quite so easy. Rack pulls, I'm going to swear, which means I'm going to have to put an explicit bit when this goes onto YouTube. But rack pulls really grip my shit because they are used in powerlifting to massage people's ego. I've seen someone, and no, I'm not naming names because I'm not that guy. I've seen someone doing a 6 to 8 inch rack pull at 300 kilos when they can only actually deadlift off the floor about 150 kilos. I mean, it looks really cool. You've got loads of weight on the bar, but it just shows that you're really good at locking stuff out, but you're really weak from the floor. So if the rationale behind using the rack pull is good, then that's fine. So for someone like Sean, potentially, that struggles with that pattern just over their knee, It might be something that once we get out of lockdown that we use with Lucas, who is really fast from the floor, but then gets to the knee and just struggles proprioceptively to not do what he's always done, so he kind of unlearn what he's already learned. We might set him a rack pull just below the knee, and it might just be a tempo rack pull. So he gets used to that pattern of delivering to just above the knee and getting the hips through and keeping the shoulders over that bar a little bit longer, rather than him just keep getting to that position and kind of not switching off, but just resorting back to, this is what I've always done when it gets hard, so this is what I'll do. So, and that's my responsibility, not just his as an athlete. So that's a really good example of how rack pulls might be used. They can be used for, if you've got that sticking point at the knee and your technique is really good above the knee, you might want to just overload through that position. So you might start just above mid shin, and you might, if your deadlift is, for example, 300 kilos, you might lift 320 kilos for 3 or 4 reps. So you can work through that weak position and hopefully gain a bit of strength through there. Probably my favorite, most of my athletes hate me for these because I will always call them out on, and it's one that if I demo, I will always hold a 2-second pause for at least 3 seconds, because I will get called out all over Instagram. A nice pause variant. So for example, if your issue is not like Lucas's is strong as hell, it's a positional thing for him rather than a lack of strength in a position. So if you have a lack of strength and you're shaking like a shitting dog when you get just below the knee, I'm going to give you a sub-maximal load, say 60%, and I'm going to get you to do a 2 to 3 second pause just below the knee at that sticking position, because I'm going to overload you and force your central nervous system to adapt in that position, and it has to be the right position before you then finish the lift. I also, one of my favorites for that are 3-to-1 deadlifts, where for 1 repetition, you'll perform 3 lifts to the knee and then followed by 1 full deadlift. I normally prescribe those in 3 sets, which is 12 movements in total. It's my favorite way of prescribing volume for deadlifts, because 9 times out of 10, most people are strong from the knee to the hip. They just need to work a little bit more from the floor to the knee. So if you do 3-to-1 deadlifts of 3 repetitions, you're getting 12 lifts, but 12 times you delivered to the knee, only 3 times you delivered over the knee. So I really like those. They absolutely suck, but they're really good. And then you have things like conjugate method. And I'm sure she's still here. Susie cursed me just before lockdown because I chucked bands at her at everything, mainly because technically she got a lot better, and she knows it's going to be coming once she can get back to certainly looking at things like her deadlift and her bench, because technically they have got a lot better. Squat is coming on nicely as well, might I add. But conjugate method is looking at that speed strength continuum to accumulate strength. They looked at, or Westside Barbell looked at utilizing that speed and strength continuum and everything in between to elicit maximal force. So they did a lot of things where they do a maximum. They might do a rack pull, for example, as their maximum lower day. And then they'd have a max speed day as well, where they would do a deadlift against bands with, say, 40% of their 1 rep max, but then the rest of the 60% with bands. So at the top, it's still 100%, but they're moving nice and fast through that range of movement. It's a really good method. I will only use it on people whose technique is absolutely nailed down. Because if you can't control the plumb line on a squat or a deadlift, and you start adding things like chains and bands and chains and bands, and then you see everyone else on the internet, chains and bands and lifting suits and their dog on their shoulders and everything else that goes on there. You're getting so far removed from the classic lift that you're no longer gaining the advantage that you are from actually training that conjugate method. So it goes back to the whole, well, why are you doing what you're doing? Linear programming will get you so far. When you have exhausted linear programming and the variables that it gives you, that's when you need to look at things like adding bands to a deadlift and things like that. I know Lucas, I've mentioned already, with specifically with deadlift, has made some really good progress. So we've now got him on banded deadlifts in lockdown. Thankfully, he's got other kit, which is great, and has just boarded his shed, or the shed area that he's in, which is great to see. We can start getting some accumulated resistance, and all that means is the weight from the floor is no longer the same as the weight that he locks out. the weight will always be harder as you develop the lift, even when you're 1 rep maxing, because you're under fatigue as you go and your central nervous system is overloaded. So doing that kind of banded deadlift works really nicely because your cells have to switch on, or the muscular structure has to switch on as you accumulate through that lift. So once you get to the knee, you get certain musculature still firing and still switching on, rather than if you just go through what you develop through that linear programming, where it just knows to just pull that one resistance through that pattern of movement. So it's something that can then, once you've exhausted all those linear programming sections, you can start to then come through and elicit more progress. So the barbell non-specific. Oh, cool. So here's my biggest thing. Do you need to do it? Can you get it from the above? So your classic program is 4 to 6 exercises of, you've probably got a squat assistance with some pause variants of something like that. You've probably then got a barbell exercise or 2 specific to the squat and in and around the squat. You've then got maybe 1 or 2 exercises, but 9 times out of 10, most of my guys go, this is taking me 2 hours. And I've only given them 6 exercises. So it depends on everything else. How does it affect your training principles and recovery? So looking at those fitness variables, how does it affect your long-term training? If you're doing 8 exercises within that, can you train tomorrow and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday? And how is it going to affect your ability to train? We know that if we train not necessarily sub-maximally, we don't want to be training sub-maximally, we want to be training optimally. So we want to elicit the optimal resistance, so the minimum effective dose for each prescription, so that we can continue to slowly chip it away at those gains. The minimum effective dose is prescribed, and we can make that without getting injured or overtraining or getting exhausted. But it does need to be specific to that micro goal. And that micro goal might be, for example, on a deadlift. And it's common in both sumo and in conventional that you may be really quad dominant and your eccentric or concentric hamstring work, your hamstrings aren't able to stay strong enough together. Claire Eads, one of my girls I know, struggles a little bit keeping those hips together. And it's a little bit of hamstring strength, I think, and or quad strength, or one or the other. I'm still yet to figure out which one it is, but we're getting there. But if it is hamstring strength that you need, and you're doing RDLs or single leg RDLs or the rest of the microcosm of things that you can prescribe, if it is hamstring strength that you need and you're prescribing Bulgarian split squats, you're no longer hitting the micro goal. You're just ticking stuff in for the sheer hell of doing stuff. You're just lifting for the sake of lifting. So if you have that goal, just keep that goal in mind and make sure that you're erring on the side of undertraining rather than erring on the side of overtraining. I think that kind of ticks that box a little bit. And I know we've got the discussion bit at the end where if people want to jump in, they can all jump in. Glad, have we got a question coming?
Would there actually be much benefit transferring to sumo for a block period? I know you've used that previously with other lifters where they switched over to sumo for a little while. So maybe one block or two.
I'm going to have a little, who's asked that? I think I mentioned after. Yeah, so Sean is probably my best example. We can hardly hear you, by the way, Glads. I think your mic's down a little bit.
Sorry, that's my bad.
Such a gamer. Yeah, so the best example I had was Sean, who was uber strong to deliver the bar to just above the knee, but really struggled with his glutes to get those glutes through. Part of it was positionally, but a lot of it was slightly weak glutes as well, which we did do a lot of work on. I think Glenn has worked with Delroy as well. I think Sean is working with Delroy at the moment, who is another absolutely awesome coach. He's got to be one of the best powerlifting coaches in the country, whether you're drug-free or not. But yeah, there is, and you can use sumo as an assistance exercise for that as well. But obviously, it is quad and glute dominant. So if you are quad and glute weak, especially if you're a low bar wide stance squatter, it's going to have some bit of benefit and carryover. But again, you have to look at the macro and the micro goals, to whether they are the right things to be looking at that time. And you know what, if you're, and I know I'm going to speak, I know Rich is not necessarily struggling for motivation right now, but hasn't necessarily got that big goal, unless he's thought about it in the last couple of weeks. Sumo, having to play with sumo for 2 or 3 weeks and just having a tinker and seeing how it feels and working on the positions, that can't be a bad thing. Especially if you've got no goals right now and you haven't got a competition coming up. There's no time like the present, especially with lockdown and not being able to do so much. So yeah, definitely a good idea. Good question. There we go. Prior questions. I think we've pretty much ticked all of those. Is there anything there we've not ticked?
Craig, can I throw another question your way?
Of course you can. Tell you what, first, let's stick. Oh no, go on. Sorry, Dean, go on.
So you spoke about assistant exercises within a powerlifting program. Now, my standpoint on assistant exercises is very different from a corrective exercise.
Yeah.
And I wondered what place corrective exercises have within a powerlifting program, because I see a lot of powerlifters that have some quite serious knee valgus, and they fail to identify the issues around the glute, which is predominantly where it comes from, because they're a weak posterior-based athlete.
Yep.
But I see coaches that then program them, like you said, tempo stuff, where in actual fact, to mitigate that problem and to ensure that they're eliciting the right response, the best thing in the first place would have been a corrective exercise rather than an assistant exercise. So I just wanted to see, like, from a powerlifting coach's perspective, and I know there's a few other guys in here, but from my part, like, what's their place within a program? Obviously athlete dependent.
Yeah, it depends clearly. But for me, if I've got someone that has a knee valgus, I'm probably going to, on squat days, as part of their warm-up routine. So I've got a standard 10-minute mobility warm-up that I would use. And they might do single leg bridges with a band around the knee, and they would hold for 2 seconds, 3 sets of 10, 3 sets of 12. Disgusting, but they get that working. They might do goblet squats, 1 1/4 goblet squats, 1 1/4 goblet squats with a band on. Everything that's going to start getting those working. Tilly is a really fine example of that as well. She had a very prominent knee valgus when we started, causing lower back issues as well, which is still there, but obviously we're making progress at the same time. If it's not too much of an issue and it's just there when it gets to 90 to 100%, then you might program them at the end. That might be your 5th and 6th exercise, or 7th and 8th exercise, depending on how often they're training throughout that week. So yeah, great question. And definitely, and it depends, but how urgent is it? If the risk of injury is high, 100% as part of the warm-up, 100%.
No,
and
I just think it's
a no-brainer.
Sorry.
That is probably not a conventional answer from a conventional deadlift powerlifting coach. Most powerlifting coaches are a little bit more old school these days.
Yeah, I think like you've alluded to there, I think you can mirror the two, like assistants and correctives can be combined together. Where they're placed in terms of the session completely depends on the athlete. A lot of my athletes will, more often than not, it will be utilized as an activation-based movement, so they'll be predominantly warm-up led.
Yeah.
But some athletes don't respond to those, and they would rather them be at the end of the session. So it does depend.
Yeah.
But no, I think you're absolutely right. I think they definitely serve a purpose, and they need to be used more. But I think more importantly is people's understanding of how they can be intertwined with assistant exercises.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's that education piece. And I know that you're very keen with your guys on making sure they understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And obviously that develops rapport and you get that buy-in of, look, if you want to squat more, glute med needs to be switching on like a lot, because it is overloaded and the knees are dropping in and you're compensating for stuff. Great question. So I think that's all of those done. These were my key takeaways. Accept that it won't be perfect, but always work towards perfect and efficient. The biggest thing for me, and it again, it depends. Obviously, I do get a few asking about coaching and programming, certainly specific for powerlifting and weightlifting, predominantly that rather than the S&C based stuff. And dependent upon the individual and how long I've known them and things like that, they'll ask how long until I am X, or here's the best question is, if I'm going to compete at 82.5, what do I need to bench? And then my answer would always be, well, what can you bench? 100 kilos. 100 kilos then. Because you'll never be able to lift as much as you want to lift. And if you go with the attitude of, I'm not going to compete, you're wasting your time. Absolutely wasting your time, because by the time you've had 5 competitions, that's the time when you need to start to go, well, now I think I'm ready to actually compete. And obviously that's the experience of coaching and lifting and everything else that comes with it. Always striving for perfection, but accept that takes time. That takes a lot of mistakes, but hopefully they are safe mistakes and safe trials, like we've done with Susie, of moving things in and out an inch or two. We had a relatively close-ish grip on her bench for quite a long time, for the first probably 6 months of working together. And actually the benefit of Susie coming to see me at least kind of once a month, which is a preference of mine, but obviously I can't enforce that on anyone. But I can then eyes on go, oh, hold on a minute, we're missing a trick here. But that first 6 months meant that her shoulder girdle was so strong, and her ability to retract and keep control of that back position was so good, that actually the transition to a nice wide grip bench and working on that arch a little bit more has been so much smoother, because we now don't have to go, well, we can't go too quick on this because you've got to work on this too. So we've already done that hard work. So it's just having that little bit of patience. Don't try and lift you don't enjoy. This is one that I'm not sure whether Liv is on, because I know she's popped and had a bit outside or something with her sister. It's similar to the one I did a couple of weeks ago. You've got to remember why you're doing this. 9 times out of 10, and the same, well, 95% of the time, we're all amateur, semi-pro athletes at best. If you're not enjoying it, why are you doing it? Glad have you on pause to add?
No, just in case anything comes up.
Sweet. Injury prevention is key in barbell sports. I banged that on about that. Excuse me. Enough now. You're probably going to have to lift for 6 to 12 months before you see. And in that 6 months, as I said, you'll get those neural gains. Those neural gains will be great, and we'll ride those as long as we can. But I mean, I've like Dave will say to me, if I can add 2.5 kilos on each lift every time I compete, he's happy. Anyone that saw Lucas's progress in the last, it's probably 6 months accumulated, but it's probably only 14 to 15 weeks worth of training in 6 months in a couple of little blocks. That doesn't come along very often, and that's a token to Lucas for working so hard at that as well. And it's probably forced him into having recovery that he probably normally wouldn't have, and that has allowed for that super compensation to take place inadvertently. Dave Heath, who is another 82.5 lifter, that is probably the reason I'm here in the first place. He's another one that he trained really hard out in Norway before the Brits. I want to say 2016, maybe 15, and he had 3 weeks where he literally couldn't train. He came back and PB'd everything because he'd allowed his body to relax and recover and make that super compensation happen. Think about the big picture. We kind of covered that with some of the assistant stuff. I love training in the gym. I love a 2-hour session. I'm a very social lifter, but I'm also very aware that I am very prone to overtraining, which is why I too have a coach who tells me to stop being stupid and tells me not to overtrain, or at least he tries to. It's not always easy. Christian, if you're here, I'm sorry. Health and performance go hand in hand. And I bang on about this one all the time, but going back to that biomechanical sliding scale, you get injured, you can't train. You can't train, your risk of injury is going to continue to go up. And if you then recover from the injury 3 months later, go back in and get another niggly injury, trust me when I say, as a master, they will haunt you for the rest of your life. You want as little niggly injuries as best as you can. So look after that body and move with efficiency. I've covered that one already. Everything below the hips is generating force. Everything above is stabilizing. Educate yourself and learn how your body works and reacts to things. I know Dean, who has kindly asked some really decent questions. I know what sort of coach Dean is as well. He is very similar in the way that I function, as well as certainly the Paisley boys are really good at asking questions and educating their guys up in Scotland as well. Self-education and asking questions and understanding the whats and whys, not only does it mean that you know what you're doing, but you buy into the process so much more. Again, I'll go back to that eccentric side of things as well. If anyone wants me to explain that at the end, I'm more than happy to. And we'll go back to these two as well. So I'm pretty sure, yeah, this is the point at which if anybody wishes to unmute their mic and have question time, you are more than welcome. I have bored you long enough with my voice. But we need to stay as optimistic as we can, certainly with the barbell sport, because once you've trained a specific sport for, let's say, 2 years, as an example, the progression will ease off. It won't be quite so much. So you need to stay optimistic in understanding things like technical progress, which will eventually bring pounds and kilograms on the bar. And the bottom one is a real kind of one for me. Dripping water hollows out stone, not through force, but through persistence. If you stay working on that good, efficient movement, similar to what Dave has over 6 to 8 years, eventually it will come through, and it's hard. It's not easy. Psychologically, that dedication and that persistence is the hardest thing to go through, but it's the one that pays off long term. There we go. Thank you very much. I'm sure I've probably bored you to tears way too much. That is your lot for today. Anyone wants to ask any questions, you are free to do so now.
Something that's just popped into my head, referenced the grip situation. I've seen previously guys, doing the pincer type movements on plates. And you ask them, what are you doing? Obviously working on my grip strength. But there's a difference between like the pincer type grip and the crushing type grip for what we would require for deadlift. Ideally train specific to what you want to be.
Oh, that's a really good one, actually. I said about hanging on a bar, towel pull-ups.
Yeah.
Stick a towel over the bar, either hang off the bar whilst grabbing the towel, because it is your hand will adapt to that position. Towel pull-ups, love them. So does Sunita. Any more? Perfect. In which case, I will stop the recording